The dust still hung in the air when Daniel Hayes arrived at what used to be his home. The walls were blackened and crumbling, smoke rising from the ruins in thin gray columns that disappeared into the evening sky. His hands trembled as he climbed down from the military transport, his boots crunching on debris and shattered glass. The other soldiers stayed back, their faces grim and uncertain. They knew what he was about to find. Someone had to tell him during the flight back, and that duty had fallen to Lieutenant Karen Stone. She had placed a hand on his shoulder and spoken the words that shattered his world. Margaret was gone. Little Emma was gone. The Kresh raiders had come through like a wildfire, hitting 3 homesteads before the defense force could respond. By the time Daniel and his unit had finished protecting the northern settlement and rushed back, it was far too late. He walked through the broken doorway, his rifle still slung across his back, though he knew there was no enemy left to fight here. The living room where Emma had played with her dolls just 2 days ago was now a chaos of overturned furniture and burned curtains. The kitchen where Margaret had kissed him goodbye that morning was unrecognizable. He found them in the back room, the one they had reinforced when they first arrived on New Montana. Margaret had pulled Emma there when the attack started, trying to protect her daughter one last time. They were holding each other. Daniel fell to his knees beside them, a sound escaping his throat that he did not recognize as his own voice. He reached out to touch Margaret's face, still unable to process that she would never open her eyes again. Emma's small hand was clutched in her mother's, and Daniel carefully placed his own hand over both of theirs. The room spun around him. This was not how it was supposed to be. He was the soldier, the protector. He was supposed to keep them safe. That was the deal. He went out and faced the dangers of this frontier world, and they stayed safe at home. But the deal was broken now, shattered as completely as the walls of his house. The hours that followed passed in a blur. Governor Lisa Warren arrived with medical personnel and other colonists. They spoke to him in soft voices, offering condolences and help. Someone brought a gravitic sled to transport the bodies. Someone else offered to contact the Colonial Mortuary Service. Daniel heard the words, but they seemed to come from very far away, as if he were underwater. When Lisa asked him about burial arrangements, something inside him finally crystallized into a single clear thought. He would do this himself. He would bury his family with his own hands. It was all he had left to give them. When the others offered to help, to dig the graves and prepare the site and stand with him during the service, he refused. His voice came out harsh and sharp, cutting through their kindness like a blade. He did not want help. He did not want company. He had failed to protect Margaret and Emma in life, and this final duty was his alone. Some of the colonists looked hurt by his rejection. Others nodded with understanding, though their eyes showed they disagreed with his decision. Lisa tried to reason with him, explaining that no one expected him to do this alone, that the community wanted to support him. But Daniel was unmovable. His grief had hardened into something cold and heavy in his chest, and it demanded that he face this burden without sharing it. He loaded the bodies onto the sled himself, wrapping them carefully in clean sheets that someone had brought. Emma looked so small, so fragile. Margaret's face was peaceful, as if she were only sleeping. Daniel had to look away. He programmed the sled's navigation system to follow him and began walking. He knew exactly where he was going. There was a hillside 3 kilometers from the ruined homestead, overlooking the valley where they had planned to build their permanent home once the colony was more established. Margaret had loved that spot. She used to take Emma there for picnics on Sunday afternoons while Daniel worked on expanding the irrigation system. Emma would run through the tall grass chasing butterflies while Margaret sat on a blanket and read from her tablet. They had talked about building a house there someday, a real house with a stone fireplace and a big kitchen and a porch where they could watch the sunsets. Now that dream was ashes, but Daniel could at least give them that hillside. He could lay them to rest in the place where they had been happiest. The walk took longer than he expected because his body was exhausted. He had been awake for 36 hours, most of that time spent in combat operations against the Kresh raiders. His muscles ached, and his hands were still raw from gripping his rifle, but he pushed forward one step at a time, the sled humming quietly behind him. A few colonists followed at a distance, unwilling to leave him completely alone despite his wishes. Daniel ignored them. When he finally reached the hillside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Margaret would have loved. Daniel stood there for a long moment, looking out over the valley, remembering all the times they had stood in this exact spot, talking about the future. Then he took the shovel he had strapped to the sled and began to dig. The ground was harder than he expected, filled with rocks and tough roots. Each shovelful required effort that his tired body barely had to give. Sweat poured down his face despite the cooling evening air. His hands began to blister. He kept digging. This was his punishment and his privilege. He would do this right. He would give them a proper resting place even if it took all night. Even if it took everything he had left. The first grave began to take shape and Daniel dug deeper, his vision blurring with tears and exhaustion. Behind him, the sled waited with its precious cargo. Around him, the evening insects began their songs. And in the distance, something moved through the trees, approaching with purposeful steps. But Daniel did not notice. He was focused entirely on the hole in the ground, on the rhythm of the shovel striking earth, on the desperate need to complete this one final task for the family he had failed to save. The shovel hit rock again and Daniel cursed, his voice breaking. He had been digging for over an hour and the grave was still not deep enough. His hands were bleeding now, the blisters having burst some time ago, but he barely felt the pain. Physical pain was nothing compared to the weight crushing his chest with every breath. He pulled the shovel back for another strike when a shadow fell across the grave. Daniel looked up, his eyes struggling to focus in the fading light. The figure standing at the edge of the hole was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with 4 arms hanging at its sides. The distinctive chitinous plates covering its body caught the last rays of sunlight, giving off a faint blue-green shimmer. A Comanche. Daniel had fought alongside the Comanche warriors during several campaigns against the Creche. They were formidable allies, deadly in combat and utterly fearless. But they kept to themselves mostly, interacting with humans only when military necessity demanded it. He had never seen one at the colony outside of official briefings. This particular Comanche wore the markings of a senior warrior, patterns etched into his chest plates that Daniel did not fully understand, but knew indicated high rank. The alien's face was harder to read than a human's, with large eyes that seemed to reflect light like a cat's and a mouth that did not quite move the way human mouths did. But there was something in his posture, in the way he stood at the edge of the grave looking down at Daniel, that suggested he was not here by accident. Daniel wiped the sweat from his eyes and climbed out of the hole, his legs shaking with exhaustion. He did not want to deal with this now. He did not want to deal with anything except finishing what he had started. The Comanche watched him in silence as Daniel picked up the shovel again. When Daniel moved to step back into the grave, the alien moved faster than seemed possible for something so large. 2 of his 4 hands reached out and grasped the shovel's handle. Daniel pulled back instinctively, anger flaring hot in his chest. He tried to yank the shovel free, but the Comanche's strength was overwhelming. The alien did not jerk or pull. He simply held the shovel steady with what seemed like no effort at all. Daniel pulled harder, his exhausted muscles screaming in protest, but he might as well have been trying to pull a tree from the ground. "Go away," Daniel said, his voice rough and hostile. "Leave me alone. I do not need help." The Comanche did not respond. Instead, he simply continued to hold the shovel, his large eyes fixed on Daniel's face. There was something in that gaze that made Daniel uncomfortable, a depth of understanding that he did not want to acknowledge. He pulled at the shovel again, harder this time, putting his whole body into it. The Comanche still did not budge. Frustration and grief and exhaustion all boiled over at once. Daniel let go of the shovel with one hand and swung at the alien's chest, his fist connecting with the chitinous armor with a dull thud that sent pain shooting up his arm. The Comanche did not even flinch. "I said go away," Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. "This is mine to do. They were mine to protect and I failed. This is all I have left. Let me do this alone. Please, just let me do this alone." The last words came out as barely more than a whisper. Daniel's legs finally gave out and he collapsed to his knees, still gripping the shovel handle with one hand, while the Comanche held the other end. Tears ran down his face, mixing with the dirt and sweat. He had not cried yet, not really, not since finding them. But now the dam had broken and he could not stop it. The Comanche stood there for a long moment, still holding the shovel, still watching Daniel with those unreadable eyes. Then slowly, carefully, he pulled the shovel from Daniel's weakened grip. Daniel expected him to hand it back or perhaps to turn and leave now that Daniel had broken down completely. Instead, the Comanche turned toward the grave and stepped to its edge. With 2 of his 4 arms, he drove the shovel into the pile of dirt beside the hole. Then he began to dig. But this was not the simple mechanical digging of someone helping with a chore. The Comanche's movements were deliberate and ritualistic. As he worked, his secondary arms began to move in complex patterns, drawing symbols in the air that glowed faintly with bioluminescence. And then he began to sing. The sound that came from the Comanche's throat was unlike anything Daniel had heard before. It was deep and resonant, vibrating in his chest like the lowest notes of an organ. The melody was strange to human ears, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. Yet there was emotion in it too, a weight of feeling that transcended species. Daniel stared up at the alien from his position on the ground, too shocked to move. He had heard stories about Comanche songs, but they were supposed to be private things, sacred ceremonies performed only among their own kind. Humans were never invited to witness them. Yet here was this warrior, singing over the graves of a human woman and child he had never met. Down the hillside, the small group of colonists who had followed Daniel at a distance had stopped moving entirely. Governor Lisa Warren stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth. Next to her, old farmer Henry Clark's eyes were wide with disbelief. Even from here, they could hear the Comanche's song carrying across the evening air, powerful and mournful and utterly unexpected. Lisa had studied Comanche culture as part of her training for the governorship. She knew what this was, or at least she thought she did, but it seemed impossible. The Comanche performed the rite of fallen warriors only for their own dead, and only for those who had earned the highest honors. For a Comanche to sing this rite for humans, especially for civilians who had never fought in battle, violated everything the scholars thought they knew about the alien culture. Yet here it was happening, right in front of them, and none of them could quite believe what they were seeing. The Comanche continued to dig, his song never faltering. Each shovelful of earth was removed with precision and care, and his secondary arms continued their dance of glowing symbols. Daniel watched from his knees, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Why was this alien doing this? What did it mean? The warrior had taken the burden from his hands without asking permission, had begun a sacred ceremony for people he had no connection to, and showed no sign of stopping or explaining himself. As the grave grew deeper under the Comanche's efforts, the song changed subtly. The melody remained the same, but new harmonics wove through it, creating layers of sound that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. Daniel realized the alien was using all four of his lungs, each one producing a different tone that blended together into something both beautiful and heartbreaking. The sun had fully set now, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The Comanche's bioluminescent markings provided a soft blue-green light that illuminated the gravesite. His song continued, filling the hillside with sounds that had never been heard on this world before. And Daniel, still kneeling in the dirt with bleeding hands and a shattered heart, began to understand that something significant was happening here, something that went far beyond one man's grief or one family's tragedy. The Comanche warrior was building a bridge between species with nothing but a shovel and a song, and Daniel did not yet know what waited on the other side. Stan's in Thunder moved to the gravitic sled where Margaret and Emma's bodies lay wrapped in clean white sheets. He stood there for a long moment, his forearms hanging at his sides, his head bowed in what could only be a gesture of respect. Daniel walked over to join him, his legs still unsteady. Together they stood beside the sled in silence, two fathers who had lost everything, separated by biology but united by grief. The Comanche spoke again, his voice quieter now, meant only for Daniel to hear, though the still night air carried his words to those nearby. My nestmate was called Sings to Morning. My offspring was barely past first molt, what you would call a child. I was leading a hunting expedition to the outer territories when the creche came to our settlement. By the time we received the distress call and returned, 3 days had passed. There were no survivors. Daniel closed his eyes, the pain in the alien's voice transcending the strangeness of his speech. 3 days. He could not imagine the horror of that, of knowing for 3 full days that something terrible had happened while being unable to reach them. His own hours of not knowing had been agony enough. The creche do not fight with honor, Stan's in Thunder continued. They do not seek combat with warriors. They hunt the vulnerable. They destroy homes and families. They create grief and fear. This is their weapon. He turned his large, reflective eyes to Daniel. When I found my family, I wanted to die. In Comanche culture, a warrior who fails his primary duty to protect his nestmate and offspring is expected to enter the death spiral. This means refusing food and water, refusing comfort until life ends. It is considered the honorable path for one who has failed so completely. Daniel felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. He understood that impulse all too well. The desire to simply stop existing, to let the grief consume him until there was nothing left. Part of him had been thinking exactly that, even if he had not put it into such clear terms. I tried to bury them alone, the Comanche continued. I went to the sacred cliff where we lay our honored dead. I began to dig the resting chambers. I was 3 days into the work, digging with my bare hands because I had refused all tools when my clan brothers came. They had given me time to grieve, but they would not let me complete the death spiral. They took me by force. They made me eat. They made me drink. They sang the rites over my family while I was too weak to resist. He paused, and one of his secondary arms reached out to touch the sled with surprising gentleness. I was angry. I fought them. I believed they were robbing me of the only honorable path left. But they did not stop. They forced me to live. And slowly, very slowly, I began to understand that they were not weak for helping me. I was not weak for needing that help. The true weakness would have been to let grief make me useless when there were still creche to fight, still families to protect. The colonists were listening intently now, drawn closer by the Comanche's words. This was more than many of them had heard any Comanche speak in months of living alongside them. Lisa Warren was recording everything on her tablet, knowing this was a historic moment even as it unfolded. Stans in Thunder looked up at the stars, his voice taking on a different quality. After my clan brothers saved me, I became obsessed with understanding the enemy that had taken my family. I studied the creche, their patterns, their psychology, and I studied the species who fought against them. I studied humans. This last word seemed to hang in the air. The way he said it suggested both curiosity and something deeper, a recognition of significance. I did not understand humans at first, he continued. Your bonds make no sense by Comanche logic. You form attachments with those not of your blood clan. You risk your lives for strangers. You call people family who share no genetic material with you. This seemed inefficient to me, illogical. But then I witnessed something that changed my understanding. He turned back to Daniel, and there was an intensity in his gaze that demanded attention. I was assigned to a joint operation on the mining world you call Kepler 442. The creche had established a stronghold in the northern canyons. The assault was difficult. Many died on both sides. I was wounded, trapped under fallen rock when a building collapsed during the fighting. I could not free myself. The creche were advancing toward my position. I prepared for death, which would have been honorable in battle. Then a human medic came. His name was Paul Stevens. He was not a soldier, just medical support. He saw me trapped and ran through enemy fire to reach me. 2 other humans provided covering fire while he dug me out. The Comanche's voice grew quieter, almost reverent. I told him to leave me. I said I was too heavy, that he could not possibly move enough rock before the creche arrived. He did not listen. He kept digging, kept pulling at the debris. The 2 soldiers ran out of ammunition. One was hit. The other dragged him to cover but could not return to help. Paul Stevens was alone with me, no weapon, enemy getting closer. He could have run. He should have run. Any rational being would have run. Daniel found himself holding his breath, knowing somehow how this story ended but needing to hear it anyway. Paul got me free, Stans in Thunder said. He actually managed it, though it should have been impossible. But the creche were too close by then. He pushed me toward cover and turned to face them with nothing but a medical kit and a knife. They killed him in seconds. I made it to the defensive line. Paul Stevens did not. The silence that followed was profound. Helen Carter was crying again, and she was not alone. The story of a medic sacrificing himself for an alien ally had struck something deep in all of them. I did not understand. Stans in Thunder continued. Paul Stevens had no clan bond with me. We had never fought together before that day. By Comanche logic, there was no reason for him to risk anything for me. Certainly not his life. I asked his commander later why Paul had done this. The commander looked at me with confusion, as if I had asked why water flows downhill. He said that Paul was a medic and I was wounded. That was all the reason needed. The Comanche gestured with all 4 arms in what might have been frustration or wonder. This answer told me nothing and everything. I began to study humans more carefully after that. I watched how you interact, how you form bonds, how you define family. And I realized that for humans, family is not about genetics or clan structure. Family is about choice, about who you stand with, about who you would die for and who you would live for. He looked directly at Daniel again. This is why humans fight so fiercely, not for territory or resources or genetic propagation. You fight for each other, for the family you have chosen. And this makes you dangerous to the Kresh in ways they do not understand. They think creating grief will break you. But grief shared between humans becomes a bond, becomes strength. Several colonists were nodding now, recognizing truth in the alien's words even if they had never articulated it themselves. Stands in Thunder reached down to the sled. With surprising gentleness for a being so large and powerful, he lifted Margaret's wrapped form. "This is why I honor your mate," he said. She chose to stand between death and her offspring. Not because instinct demanded it, though instinct was surely part of it, but because she had chosen Emma as her family, and humans do not abandon family. This is warrior spirit that transcends species. He carried Margaret to the first grave and carefully lowered her down, positioning her with a care that spoke of deep respect. Then he returned for Emma, lifting the small wrapped form even more gently. "This is why I honor your offspring." She faced death held by love. In those final moments, she was not alone. She was with family. This is what humans understand that Kresh cannot comprehend. Death is not the defeat. Dying alone and unloved is the defeat. He placed Emma in the second grave, adjusting her position with delicate precision. Then he straightened and looked at the assembled colonists, his voice rising to carry to everyone present. "I came to New Montana when I heard of the Kresh attack. I asked for assignment here specifically. Not because of strategic importance, not because of duty, but because I knew what survivors of such an attack would be feeling. I knew the death spiral that would call to them. And I knew that if I could help even one human understand what my clan brothers taught me, that grief shared is grief diminished, then Paul Stevens' sacrifice would have even greater meaning." Daniel felt tears running down his face again, but they were different now. Still painful, still born of immeasurable loss, but no longer quite so isolating. He looked at Stands in Thunder, this alien warrior who had crossed species boundaries to teach him that he did not have to suffer alone, and he found his voice. "Thank you." The words were inadequate, but they were all he had. Stands in Thunder placed one large hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Now we fill the graves together. Not you alone, not me alone. Together. And everyone here who wishes to help will help. This is how humans heal. This is how Comanche heal. This is how all beings who know love should heal." He reached down and picked up the shovel, offering it to Daniel. But this time, when Daniel took it, he was not taking it to work alone. He was taking it to begin a shared labor, surrounded by community, watched over by an alien warrior who understood his pain, and somehow that made all the difference. Daniel took the first shovelful of earth and let it fall gently into Margaret's grave. The sound of dirt hitting the wrapped form was somehow both final and beginning, an ending and a transformation. He took another shovelful, then another, working slowly and carefully. Stands in Thunder stood beside him, using his 4 hands to guide some of the larger stones away from the grave opening, ensuring they would not damage what lay below. After a few minutes, Henry Clark stepped forward from the gathered crowd. He did not ask permission, did not announce his intention. He simply picked up a second shovel that someone had brought up from the settlement and began helping with Emma's grave. His weathered face was set with determination, tears running into his gray beard. Then Helen Carter came forward, kneeling at the edge of Margaret's grave. She had brought something wrapped in cloth. Carefully, she unwrapped it to reveal a small wooden box, hand-carved with images of butterflies and flowers. Inside were drawings that Emma had made in school over the past year. Pictures of the family homestead, of alien animals she had seen, of her mother and father. Helen's voice shook as she spoke. Emma made these in class. She was so proud of them. She wanted to save them forever. I thought Margaret might want to have them. She placed the box carefully beside Margaret's wrapped form before the earth covered it. The gesture broke something open in the assembled crowd. This was not just a burial anymore. This was the community saying goodbye to 2 of their own. More colonists began to come forward, each bringing something small to add to the graves. A farmer named George Martinez brought seeds from Earth, heirloom tomatoes that Margaret had loved and had helped him cultivate in New Montana's soil. He scattered them gently over her grave as the earth slowly filled it in. A soldier from Daniel's unit, Corporal Susan Blake, brought Emma's favorite toy, a stuffed rabbit that had somehow survived the destruction of the homestead. She placed it in Emma's grave with shaking hands, her military composure cracking as she whispered goodbye to the little girl who used to show her bug collections. Governor Lisa Warren came forward with a tablet displaying the colony's official records. She read aloud Margaret's contributions to the settlement, the families she had helped, the community projects she had organized, the gardens she had planted. It was a recitation of a life lived in service to others, small acts of kindness that had woven through the colony like threads holding fabric together. When she finished, her voice was barely above a whisper. New Montana is less without her. We all are. The graves were filling slowly, each person who came forward adding their earth and their memories. And as they worked, something remarkable began to happen. Other Comanche warriors started to emerge from the darkness beyond the circle of gathered humans. They came silently, moving through the crowd like ghosts. There were 5 of them initially, all bearing the markings of senior warriors. They formed a loose semicircle behind Stands in Thunder, and without any apparent signal they began to sing. The sound was overwhelming. 6 Comanche voices raised in harmony, each one using all 4 of their lungs to produce multiple tones simultaneously. The song was different from what Stands in Thunder had sung before, deeper and more complex. It created harmonics that seemed impossible, notes that resonated in the chest and bones of every human present. Lisa Warren's hands were shaking as she made notes. This was unprecedented, not just one Comanche honoring human dead, but multiple warriors joining in a collective ceremony. The cultural barriers that had existed since first contact were crumbling, right here on this hillside. The implications were staggering. She looked at the warriors, at their ceremonial postures and glowing bioluminescent markings, and realized she was witnessing something that scholars would study for generations. A species that jealously guarded its traditions was opening them to humanity, not through negotiation or cultural exchange programs, but through shared grief. The Comanche song wove through the night air as the colonists continued their work. More people kept arriving, the entire settlement seemingly drawn to the hillside. They came with lanterns and glow sticks, lighting the area with a soft, warm radiance. Someone had brought up a portable heater as the temperature dropped. Someone else had brought water and food, though no one felt much like eating. They came because they were family, in the way that humans defined family, not through blood but through choice and shared experience and the bonds forged in the crucible of frontier life. Daniel worked steadily, his bleeding hands finally starting to hurt as the adrenaline and shock wore off. But the pain was distant, manageable. What mattered was the rhythm of the work, the presence of others helping to bear the burden, the knowledge that Margaret and Emma were being laid to rest with honor and love. Stands in Thunder never left his side, occasionally directing the placement of earth with gentle guidance, his song never faltering. At some point, Daniel realized he was singing too. Not words, just a humming that matched some of the tones the Comanche were producing. Other humans joined in, finding their own notes within the alien harmony. It should not have worked. Human and Comanche vocal structures were completely different, but somehow the sounds blended together into something greater than either species could produce alone. It was messy and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. Margaret's grave was nearly full now. The wooden box of Emma's drawings was covered, the seeds scattered, the earth forming a gentle mound. Daniel placed the last shovelful himself, patting it down with his damaged hands. Then he simply stood there, staring at the fresh earth, trying to comprehend that his wife lay beneath it, that he would never hear her laugh again, never feel her hand in his, never watch her read to Emma on Sunday afternoons. The grief tried to pull him down, to drag him into that death spiral that Stands in Thunder had described. But there were hands on his shoulders now, human and Comanche both, holding him up, keeping him grounded, reminding him that he was not alone. Emma's grave was finished minutes later. The small mound seemed impossibly tiny, a physical reminder of how young she had been, how much life she should have had ahead of her. Helen Carter placed wildflowers on the grave, native New Montana blooms in purple and gold. Others added their own flowers until both graves were covered in color. The Comanche song reached a crescendo and then slowly faded, the warriors letting the final notes drift away into the starlit sky. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by quiet weeping and the whisper of wind through grass. Stands in Thunder stepped back from the graves and raised all 4 of his arms to the sky. The other Comanche warriors did the same, creating a living framework around the burial site. Their bioluminescent markings flared bright, brighter than they had been all night, turning the hilltop into a gallery of blue-green light. It was a salute, Daniel realized, a final honor guard for the fallen. Then Stands in Thunder lowered his arms and turned to face the assembled crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly to everyone present. What happened here tonight is new. Comanche have never honored non-Comanche dead in this way. Many of my people will question this choice. Some will say I have violated sacred traditions. But I say that traditions which cannot grow, cannot adapt to new understanding, are already dead. He gestured toward the graves with two of his hands. These humans showed warrior spirit. The community that gathers here shows warrior spirit. The choice to help one another, to share grief instead of bearing it alone, to form bonds beyond blood and genetics. This is warrior spirit that my people are only beginning to understand. Paul Stevens showed me this when he died to save me. Now I show my people by honoring these dead. Perhaps other Comanche will understand. Perhaps they will not. But I make this choice freely and I do not regret it. Lisa Warren stepped forward, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. On behalf of the colony of New Montana, I thank you, Stands in Thunder, and I thank all the Comanche warriors present. You have honored us beyond measure. You have shown us that the bonds between our species can be deeper than we imagined. We will remember this night. We will remember what you have taught us about grief and strength and family. The governor paused, then added something that had not been planned. I propose that this site be designated as the Hill of Shared Sorrow, a memorial not just for Margaret and Emma Hayes, but for all those, human and Comanche and any other species who stands with us, who have fallen defending others. A place where grief is shared and therefore diminished. A place where species boundaries matter less than shared values. The gathered colonists murmured their approval. Even the Comanche warriors seemed to understand the significance of the proposal, their postures shifting in what might have been agreement. Daniel looked around at all the faces, human and alien, illuminated by lantern light and bioluminescence. These were his people, his family, not by blood but by choice and shared hardship and mutual respect. Margaret and Emma were gone, and that loss would never fully heal. But he was not alone in his grief. He had never been alone, even when he had tried to force solitude upon himself. Stands in Thunder had understood that, had crossed species boundaries to teach him that fundamental truth. And in doing so, the days following the burial passed in a strange haze for Daniel. The colony had set up a rotation of people to check on him, bringing food and help with the cleanup of his destroyed homestead. He wanted to refuse their assistance, old habits of self-reliance dying hard, but every time he opened his mouth to send someone away, he remembered Stands in Thunder's words. You are not alone. So he let them help. He let Helen Carter organize the salvage of anything worth keeping from the ruins. He let George Martinez and Henry Clark help him sort through the debris, separating what could be rebuilt from what needed to be hauled away. He let Susan Blake sit with him in the evenings when the silence became too heavy, not talking much, just being present. And every morning, just after dawn, Stands in Thunder came to the Hill of Shared Sorrow. Daniel would find him already there when he arrived, standing between the two graves with his forearms folded in what Daniel had learned was a Comanche posture of meditation. The first few mornings they did not speak. They simply stood together as the sun rose over the valley, two beings connected by parallel losses. On the fourth morning, Daniel finally broke the silence. Tell me about them. Your family. Stands in Thunder's eyes, which had been watching the sunrise, shifted to Daniel. For a long moment, the Comanche said nothing, and Daniel wondered if he had overstepped some cultural boundary. But then the alien began to speak, his voice quiet and measured. Sings to Morning was a scholar. She studied the old songs, the history of our people preserved in melody and rhythm. She could recall genealogies going back 200 generations through song alone. This was considered a great gift among our people. He paused, and something in his posture softened. She sang to me the first time we met. I was a young warrior, full of pride and violence. She was demonstrating an ancient battle song at a gathering of clans. I heard her voice and I understood for the first time that strength could exist in something other than combat ability. I pursued her for 3 cycles before she agreed to become my nestmate. She said I needed to learn patience. She was correct. Daniel found himself smiling slightly despite the sadness in the story. Margaret had made him work for it too. She had been working as a colonial administrator on Mars when they met. He had been a junior officer providing security for a diplomatic function. She had lectured him about proper procedure when he had been too aggressive with a suspected threat. He had been annoyed at the time, thinking she did not understand the realities of security work, but he had also been intrigued by her confidence and her refusal to be intimidated by his rank or his attitude. It had taken him months to convince her to have dinner with him. "And your offspring?" Daniel asked gently. Stan's and Thunder's bioluminescent markings flickered in a pattern Daniel was beginning to recognize as emotion. Smallstorm was curious about everything, constantly asking questions, constantly exploring, constantly finding new ways to create problems. He paused. And if a Comanche could smile, Daniel thought Stan's and Thunder might be doing the equivalent. When he was very young, barely able to walk steadily, he managed to climb into the food storage and release all our preserved grains. It took a full day to clean the mess. Sings to Morning was furious. I was trying not to laugh because he looked so proud of himself. Daniel laughed softly at the image, and it felt strange. He had not laughed since before the attack. Emma did something similar once. She found Margaret's baking supplies and decided to make us breakfast. We woke up to find the entire kitchen covered in flour and something that might have been intended as pancakes but looked more like disaster experiments. Margaret was horrified, but I could see she was also trying not to laugh. Emma had this flour handprint on her face, and she was so pleased with herself. The memory hurt, but it hurt less sharing it with someone who understood. They stood in silence for a while. Then Stan's and Thunder spoke again. "I want to tell you something I learned after my family died. Something that took me a long time to understand." Daniel looked at him, waiting. The Comanche continued, his voice thoughtful. "I believed that if I had been there, I could have saved them. I replayed the scenario countless times in my mind, imagining how I would have fought, how I would have protected them. This belief, that I could have made a difference, was destroying me. My clan brother finally forced me to see the truth." "What truth?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he knew. "The Kresh sent 37 warriors to our settlement. I would have died the same as everyone else. Perhaps I would have killed some of them first, but the outcome would have been the same. The only difference is that I would be dead too, and there would be no one to remember Sings to Morning and Smallstorm. No one to carry their memory forward. No one to ensure their deaths had meaning by preventing others from suffering the same fate." The words hit Daniel hard. He had been thinking the exact same thing, imagining scenarios where he stayed home instead of going on that patrol, where he fought off the raiders and saved his family. But the report said there had been at least 20 Kresh in the attack on his homestead. He would have died. Margaret and Emma would have died anyway. The only difference would be that he would not be here now, suffering but alive and able to ensure their deaths were not forgotten. "You are thinking this is cold comfort," Stan's and Thunder said, reading Daniel's expression with surprising accuracy. "It is. But it is also truth, and truth is necessary for healing. We cannot change what happened. We can only choose what happens next." Daniel nodded slowly. "What did you choose?" "I chose to hunt Kresh with purpose instead of rage. Rage makes warriors careless. Purpose makes warriors effective. I studied their patterns, their tactics, their psychology. I became very good at killing them. This helped for a time, but it was not enough. Revenge is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. It does not work, so what did work?" Daniel asked. Stan's and Thunder turned to face him fully, all four arms making gestures that emphasized his words. "I had to find new purpose beyond revenge. I had to accept that my family was gone and I could not bring them back. I had to understand that honoring their memory meant living in a way that would have made them proud, not destroying myself through grief and rage." He paused, "And I had to let others help me. This was hardest part. Comanche culture values individual strength. Asking for help is seen as weakness. But my clan brothers taught me that refusing help when it is needed is the true weakness." Daniel felt those words sink deep. He had been raised with similar values, the military culture of self-reliance and toughness. The idea that accepting help was somehow admitting failure. But watching this massive alien warrior speak openly about needing others challenged everything he thought he knew about strength. They talked for hours that morning, trading stories about their families, about their losses, about the struggles they had faced in the aftermath. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the valley below came fully awake with the sounds of the colony going about its daily business. But on the hill of shared sorrow, two warriors continued their conversation. building a friendship founded on mutual understanding and shared pain. When they finally parted ways, Daniel heading back to work on his homestead and Stands in Thunder, returning to his duties at the garrison, something had shifted. Daniel felt less alone, less adrift. The grief was still there, as heavy as ever, but it no longer felt like it was crushing him. It felt more like a weight he was learning to carry, and the presence of others willing to help shoulder that weight made all the difference. Over the following weeks, the bond between Daniel and Stands in Thunder deepened. The Comanche began teaching Daniel some of his people's meditation techniques, methods for managing difficult emotions that had been refined over thousands of years. Daniel found them helpful, though they felt strange at first. In return, Daniel taught Stands in Thunder more about human customs and culture, helping him understand the nuances of interaction that went beyond simple language. They trained together, combining human and Comanche combat techniques in ways that surprised both of them. They worked together on rebuilding Daniel's homestead, Stands in Thunder's forearm strength making tasks that would have taken Daniel weeks take only days. And they returned to the Hill of Shared Sorrow every morning, a ritual that grounded both of them and provided a space for continued healing. But what surprised Daniel most was how the relationship between humans and Comanche throughout the entire colony began to change. Other Comanche warriors started seeking out more interaction with the colonists. They began accepting invitations to social gatherings that they would have refused before. They started volunteering to help with colony projects that were not strictly military in nature, and the humans responded in kind, showing genuine interest in Comanche culture, asking questions, seeking to understand rather than simply coexist. Governor Lisa Warren called it the Hill of Shared Sorrow effect in her reports to the colonial administration. What Stands in Thunder had started by honoring Margaret and Emma's deaths was rippling outward, changing the relationship between the two species in ways that formal diplomatic efforts had failed to achieve. Cultural barriers that had seemed insurmountable were falling because individuals had chosen to see each other. The battle for Redstone Standing lasted 3 brutal days. The infiltration plan worked better than anyone had hoped, with the human-led strike teams creating chaos behind Creche lines, while the main Comanche force pressed the frontal assault. The Creche, caught between multiple threats and unable to coordinate their defense, broke and retreated. Casualties were heavy on all sides, but the settlement was saved. Daniel survived, as did Stands in Thunder and most of the human volunteers from New Montana. Susan Blake took a bad hit during the second day, but the Comanche medics managed to stabilize her. Andrew Foster saved a squad of Comanche warriors by crawling through enemy fire to repair a disabled vehicle, earning him a battlefield commendation that would later cause ripples through both human and Comanche command structures. But more important than the tactical victory was what happened in the aftermath. The Comanche High Council, watching the battle unfold through combat reports, saw human soldiers risking their lives to defend a Comanche world. They saw the effectiveness of combined human Comanche tactics. They saw Stands in Thunder's controversial cultural bridge building vindicated in blood and fire. And they began to reconsider their cautious approach to human relations. 3 weeks after the battle, Daniel stood once again on the Hill of Shared Sorrow. Dawn was breaking over New Montana, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. The graves were well tended as always, fresh flowers placed by colonists who continued to visit regularly. Stands in Thunder was beside him as he had been every morning since their return. The ritual resumed without discussion or awkwardness. But today felt different. Today there was news. Governor Lisa Warren had called a colony-wide assembly for later that morning, and rumors were spreading about major announcements from both the Human Colonial Administration and the Comanche High Council. Daniel suspected he knew what at least part of it would be about. The success at Redstone Standing had generated extensive reports and analysis. The human volunteers' actions had not gone unnoticed. Stands in Thunder spoke quietly, his eyes on the sunrise. Much has changed since I first came to this hill. I came to honor your dead and teach you about shared grief. I did not expect to learn so much myself. Daniel glanced at his friend. What did you learn? That humans are more like Comanche than my people believed? Or perhaps that Comanche are more like humans than we admitted? We both understand loyalty. We both understand sacrifice. We both understand that family is worth fighting for, worth dying for. The differences in how we define family are smaller than the similarities in how we honor it. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, then began their walk back toward the settlement. Other colonists were already moving toward the central square where the assembly would be held. There was an energy in the air, anticipation mixed with curiosity. When Daniel and Stands in Thunder arrived, the square was packed with people. All the human colonists seemed to be present, along with every Comanche warrior stationed at New Montana. Governor Warren stood on a raised platform with several other officials. Next to her, surprisingly, stood Breaks the Shield, the senior Comanche commander from the Redstone Standing operation. His presence suggested this announcement involved both species at high levels. Lisa waited for the crowd to settle, then began speaking, her voice amplified by the public address system. Citizens of New Montana, warriors of the Comanche garrison, I have received official communications from both the Human Colonial Council and the Comanche High Council. These communications concern the future of human-Comanche relations, and they directly impact our colony. She paused for effect. The Colonial Council has authorized the expansion of joint military operations between human and Comanche forces. All frontier colonies will now have integrated defense units combining personnel from both species. This is a direct result of the success we have seen here on New Montana, and the effectiveness demonstrated during the Redstone Standing operation. The crowd murmured with approval. This was good news, but not entirely surprising given recent events. But Lisa continued, and her next words caused the murmurs to turn into shocked exclamations. Additionally, the Comanche High Council has made an unprecedented decision. They have authorized the opening of Comanche cultural sites to human visitors and the establishment of formal cultural exchange programs. Comanche ceremonies that were previously private will now be shared with humans who show proper respect and interest. This has never been done before in Comanche history. Breaks the Shield stepped forward and the crowd went silent. Comanche commanders were not known for making public addresses, especially not to mixed-species audiences. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, suggesting he had been practicing for this moment. The Comanche High Council has watched what happened here on New Montana with great interest. We watched Stands in Thunder break with tradition to honor human dead. Many of us were troubled by this. We believed he was weakening our culture, diluting what makes Comanche strong. He paused, his large eyes sweeping across the crowd. We were wrong. Stands in Thunder showed us that strength comes not from isolation, but from bonds forged with those who share our values. When humans volunteered to fight for Redstone Standing, when they risked their lives to defend Comanche civilians, they proved that the bonds between our species are real and meaningful. They proved that family, as humans define it, can cross species boundaries. The old commander's posture shifted into what Daniel recognized as deep respect. The High Council has therefore decided to honor all humans who fought at Redstone Standing as clan brothers and clan sisters. This is the first time in our recorded history that non-Comanche have been given this status. You are now considered family by all Comanche, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. The crowd erupted in shocked conversation. This was enormous. Clan brother status in Comanche culture was not just symbolic. It carried real legal and social weight. It meant the humans so honored could call on any Comanche for aid and would be expected to provide aid in return. It meant they were part of the greater Comanche family structure, protected and valued. Breaks the Shield raised his forearms for silence. Furthermore, the High Council has authorized the construction of a monument here on New Montana. It will stand on this hill where Stands in Thunder first honored human dead with Comanche ceremony. The monument will commemorate the beginning of true family bonds between our species. It will remind future generations that grief shared becomes strength, and strength shared becomes victory. He turned to look directly at Stands in Thunder. The High Council also wishes to acknowledge that Stands in Thunder acted with wisdom, when many of us believed he acted with foolishness. His breaking of tradition created new tradition, better tradition. He is honored for his courage in doing what was right, rather than what was expected. Daniel saw his friend's markings flare bright with emotion. Stands in Thunder stood straighter, his posture reflecting both pride and humility. Governor Warren spoke again. There is one more announcement. The Colonial Council has approved the redesignation of this settlement. We are no longer simply New Montana Colony. We are now officially New Montana, the sister settlement, in recognition of our role in fostering the first true family bonds between humans and Comanche. Additionally, this hill will be formally designated as the Hill of Shared Sorrow and Shared Strength, serving as a memorial and gathering place for both species. The crowd's response was overwhelming. Humans and Comanche alike were talking excitedly, the noise level rising to almost painful levels. Daniel felt hands on his shoulders, colonists congratulating him, thanking him. He saw Susan Blake being embraced by several Comanche warriors, the beings who had saved her life during the battle. He saw Helen Carter talking animatedly with a Comanche who was carefully holding one of Emma's drawings that Helen had brought to show him. Later that afternoon, after the assembly had dissolved and people had scattered to process the news, Daniel found himself back on the hill. He was not alone. Nearly 50 people, human and Comanche both, had gathered there spontaneously. They came to see the place where everything had changed, to pay respects to the graves that had started it all. Henry Clark was there with his wife, placing more flowers. George Martinez was explaining his farming techniques to two interested Comanche, who apparently had agricultural backgrounds. A group of human children, including some who had been Emma's classmates, were playing with young Comanche, the offspring of warriors who had been brought to the colony recently. They were teaching each other games, laughing at the differences in their abilities and finding ways to make the games work for both species. Stans and Thunder approached Daniel, and for once his usual measured composure seemed shaken. "I did not expect this. When I came here to honor your family, I did it because I believed it was right, not because I expected my people to approve. Now they are calling it wisdom." Daniel smiled. "Sometimes doing the right thing looks like foolishness until time proves otherwise. You took a risk honoring Margaret and Emma. You took a bigger risk sharing your own grief with me, but those risks built something important." The Comanche nodded slowly. 3 months after the burial, the Hill of Shared Sorrow had become something more than just a gravesite. Colonists came there regularly now, not just to visit Margaret and Emma's graves, but to find a moment of peace in the chaos of frontier life. Someone had built simple benches from local wood. Someone else had created a small garden with both earth plants and native New Montana species growing together in harmonious disorder. It had become a place of reflection, of remembrance, and increasingly of connection between humans and Comanche. The Comanche warriors stationed at the colony had begun using the hill for their own ceremonies. This was unprecedented. Comanche spiritual practices had always been strictly private, performed away from the eyes of other species. But something about this place, consecrated by Stans and Thunder's initial ceremony, had made it acceptable for them to share these intimate rituals with humans. Daniel often saw small groups of Comanche at the hill during dawn or dusk, their bioluminescent markings glowing as they performed meditations or sang quiet songs. The humans learned to give them space during these times, respecting the sacredness of what was happening, even if they did not fully understand it. Daniel himself had returned to active duty, assigned to a joint human-Comanche tactical unit that operated throughout the sector. It was exactly what he needed. The structure of military life gave his days purpose and direction. The missions against Kresh raiding parties gave him an outlet for the anger that still lurked beneath his grief, and the presence of Stans and Thunder as his partner in combat gave him someone who understood both his pain and his need to channel it into something productive. They made an effective team. Daniel's human tactical thinking combined with Stans and Thunder's Comanche warrior instincts created an approach to combat that consistently surprised their enemies. They had participated in 7 operations together, and all 7 had been successful. The Kresh were learning to fear the pairing of a human and Comanche fighting side by side with perfect coordination. But the partnership was more than just military effectiveness. The other soldiers, both human and Comanche, watched Daniel and Stans and Thunder and began to emulate their relationship. Training exercises that had once been stiffly formal between the two species became more relaxed and collaborative. Humans started picking up Comanche combat techniques. Comanche started adopting human tactical innovations. The barriers were breaking down not through official policy but through individual friendships forged and shared purpose. Governor Lisa Warren had documented all of this in extensive reports to the Colonial Administration and the Comanche High Council. The response from both governments had been cautious interest. The human bureaucrats were pleased that relations with the Comanche were improving, but wary of moving too fast and disrupting what seemed to be a fragile development. The Comanche High Council was more complex in their reaction. Some members praised Stans and Thunder for finding common ground with humans and strengthening the alliance. Others criticized him for diluting Comanche traditions and showing weakness by becoming too attached to another species. The debate was apparently quite heated, with no clear consensus emerging. But then something happened that changed everything. A Comanche colony world called Redstone Standing came under massive Kresh attack. The assault was coordinated and brutal, involving hundreds of Kresh warriors and multiple ships. The Comanche garrison fought fiercely but was overwhelmed. Distress calls went out across the sector, requesting immediate assistance. The human colonial fleet responded within hours, but the nearest ships were still 2 days away at maximum burn. It looked like Redstone Standing would fall before help could arrive. The Comanche High Council sent urgent messages to all Comanche military units in the region, ordering them to converge on Redstone Standing immediately. Among those units was the garrison at New Montana, including Stands and Thunder's tactical team. They were authorized to depart immediately, leaving the human colony with reduced protection while they raced to defend their own people. Daniel was in a planning meeting with Governor Warren when Stands and Thunder entered the command center. The Comanche warrior's posture was tense, his markings flickering with what Daniel had learned to recognize as agitation. He spoke formally, addressing Warren rather than Daniel, his English more stilted than usual as stress affected his language processing. Governor Warren, I must inform you that all Comanche forces are being recalled to defend Redstone Standing. We depart within the hour. New Montana will have reduced security until human reinforcements arrive. I apologize for this necessity. Lisa nodded gravely. I understand. Your people need you. Go with our hopes for your success. But Stands and Thunder did not move to leave. Instead, he turned to Daniel and his posture shifted into something more personal, less formal. I wish you to come with me, you and other human soldiers who are willing. This is not an official request through command channels. This is me as clan brother asking you to stand with my people as I stood with yours. The room went silent. What Stands and Thunder was suggesting was highly irregular. He was asking human soldiers to leave their post to fight in a battle that was not their responsibility, to defend a world that was not their colony. It could be seen as abandoning their duty. It could strain relations with the colonial administration. It was exactly the kind of complicated political situation that military regulations were designed to prevent. Daniel looked at Governor Warren, silently asking for permission. She studied his face for a long moment, then looked at Stands and Thunder. The Comanche warrior stood with all four arms spread in a gesture that Daniel recognized as supplication, something Comanche rarely did in front of other species. Lisa's expression was unreadable as she considered the situation. Finally, she spoke carefully. I cannot order any human soldiers to join this mission. It is outside our area of responsibility and would leave our own colony understaffed. However, I also cannot prevent volunteers from choosing where they wish to fight. If certain soldiers were to take personal leave and happen to travel toward Redstone Standing, that would be their choice. She paused significantly. I would note for the record that Captain Hayes and several others are due for leave time, and I would personally approve any such leave requests filed in the next, say, 10 minutes. Daniel felt a surge of gratitude for his governor's willingness to bend rules for the right reasons. He stood immediately. I volunteer. I will file leave paperwork immediately and prepare for departure. Susan Blake was in the room and she stood as well. I am coming too. She looked at Stands and Thunder. You saved my life during the canyon operation. I will stand with you now. More voices joined in. Corporal Andrew Foster from Engineering, Lieutenant Kevin Ortiz from Intelligence, Private Amy Richardson from Medical. Within minutes, 15 human soldiers had volunteered to join the Comanche Relief Force. It was not a large number, but it represented nearly a third of the human military personnel stationed at New Montana. It was a significant commitment. Stands and Thunder's markings flared bright with what Daniel had learned was the Comanche equivalent of intense emotion. He placed one hand over his chest in a gesture of gratitude. You honor me. You honor my people. I will not forget this. Neither will the Comanche High Council. The preparation for departure was chaotic but efficient. The human volunteers grabbed their gear and loaded onto the Comanche transport ship that was already warming up its engines on the landing pad. The ship was designed for Comanche physiology, so everything was slightly too large and positioned oddly for humans, but they made it work. As the transport lifted off, Daniel looked out the viewport at New Montana falling away below. The hill of shared sorrow was visible in the distance, a small green space on the hillside that held so much meaning. He wondered if he would see it again. The Creche attack on Redstone Standing was massive, and there was no guarantee they would survive the coming battle. But he had made his choice. Stands in Thunder had stood with him in his darkest moment, had honored his family when he had no obligation to do so. Now Daniel would stand with Stands in Thunder's people in their moment of need. This was what it meant to be clan brothers. This was what humanity understood about family. The journey to Redstone Standing took 18 hours at maximum speed. During that time, the human soldiers integrated with the Comanche warriors on the ship, planning tactics and coordinating their approach. The Comanche were initially uncertain about how to work with the humans in this context, but Stands in Thunder served as bridge and translator, helping both groups understand each other's strengths and methods. Daniel found himself in a strategy session with 3 Comanche commanders, all of them senior warriors with extensive combat experience. They were skeptical at first about the humans' ability to contribute meaningfully to the battle. Comanche warriors were individually more powerful than humans, with greater strength, faster reflexes, and natural armor. What could these smaller, weaker beings offer? Stands in Thunder answered before Daniel could. Humans think differently than Comanche. We are straightforward fighters. We rely on strength and courage. Humans rely on deception and improvisation. They are excellent at finding unexpected solutions to problems. The first grave was finished within 30 minutes of the Comanche taking the shovel. What would have taken Daniel hours in his exhausted state had been completed with methodical efficiency. The warriors' forearms worked in perfect coordination, 2 digging while the other 2 maintained the ritual gestures and glowing symbols. His song never stopped, the deep resonant tones rolling across the hillside like distant thunder. Daniel had finally managed to get to his feet, standing unsteadily a few paces from the grave. His mind was still trying to process what was happening. The practical part of him recognized that he needed the help, that his body was at its limit, but the grief-stricken part that wanted to suffer alone felt almost violated by this intrusion, even as another deeper part of him felt something like gratitude. The Comanche began the second grave without pause, positioning it carefully beside the first. His movements remained ritualistic and precise, each shovelful of earth placed with deliberate care. The bioluminescent patterns his secondary arms drew in the air grew more complex, forming shapes that hung glowing for several seconds before fading. Daniel found himself mesmerized by them despite his confusion and pain. Governor Lisa Warren had moved closer now, climbing the hillside with careful steps. Several other colonists followed her, including Henry Clark and the colony's teacher Helen Carter. They stayed back from the gravesite itself, forming a loose semicircle that gave Daniel and the Comanche space while still being present. Lisa's face was pale in the starlight, her expression mixing awe and something like fear. She had pulled out her tablet and was frantically scrolling through files, comparing what she was witnessing with what was recorded about Comanche culture. When she found what she was looking for, she went even paler. Henry noticed and moved closer to her, speaking in a low whisper that still carried in the quiet evening air. "What is it?" he asked. "What is he doing?" Lisa's voice shook when she answered. "It is the right of fallen warriors, the highest honor the Comanche give to their dead. It is only performed for warriors who died defending their clan, or who showed exceptional courage in impossible situations." She paused, looking up at the massive alien figure working in the grave. "But it is never performed for non-Comanche. Never. In all our records of contact with them, there is not a single instance of this rite being extended to another species." Helen Carter had tears running down her face as she listened to the Comanche's song. She had taught Emma in the colony school, had watched the little girl grow from a shy 5-year-old into a bright and curious 7-year-old, who loved books about animals and drew pictures of the alien wildlife on New Montana. The idea that this alien warrior was honoring that little girl with his people's most sacred ceremony was almost too much to bear. Other colonists continued to arrive, drawn by word spreading through the settlement about what was happening on the hillside. They came quietly, respectfully, forming an ever-growing circle around the gravesite. Among them were families that Margaret had helped when they first arrived on the colony, offering advice and shared meals to ease the transition to frontier life. There were farmers who had traded seeds and equipment with Daniel, soldiers who had served under his command, and children who had played with Emma. They came because they cared. because Margaret and Emma had been part of their community, and because something profound was unfolding that they needed to witness. The Comanche showed no reaction to the growing audience. His focus remained entirely on the graves, on the song, on the ritual. The second grave was taking shape now, deep enough for its purpose. As he worked, something began to change in the quality of his song. New tones emerged, higher and lighter than before, weaving through the deep bass notes like silver threads through dark cloth. It took Daniel several moments to realize what he was hearing. The Comanche was singing two different melodies simultaneously, one for each grave, one for Margaret and one for Emma. The alien had somehow understood that this was a mother and daughter, and he was honoring each of them individually within the larger ceremony. The realization broke something open in Daniel's chest. This being, this alien warrior from a species humanity had only known for a handful of years, understood his loss in a way that transcended language and culture. The Comanche completed the second grave and climbed out with fluid grace despite his massive size. He stood between the two holes, his forearms spread wide, and his song reached a crescendo that seemed to vibrate the very air. The bioluminescent symbols he had been drawing throughout the ceremony suddenly flared bright, all of them appearing at once in a complex pattern that surrounded the graves like a glowing web. Then, as the final note of his song faded into the night, the symbols slowly dimmed and disappeared. The hillside fell into profound silence. Even the evening insects had gone quiet, as if they too recognized the sacredness of what had just occurred. The Comanche stood motionless for a long moment, his large eyes reflecting the starlight. Then he turned to face Daniel. When he spoke, it was the first time Daniel had heard him use human language. His voice was deep and resonant like his song, but the words were clear despite the accent. "I am called Stands in Thunder. I was not always here." The broken grammar suggested he was still learning English, but the meaning was unmistakable. He had come to New Montana specifically, deliberately for a reason he had not yet explained. Daniel found his voice, though it came out hoarse and weak. "Why are you doing this?" "They were not warriors. They were just my family." Stands in Thunder tilted his head in a gesture that might have been the Comanche equivalent of a nod. "Not warriors with weapons, but warriors still. Your mate protected your offspring when death came. She did not run. She did not surrender. She stood between danger and her young. This is warrior spirit. This is courage. Your offspring did not die in fear alone. She died held by love. This too is warrior spirit. To face the end with love instead of hate." He paused, and something in his posture shifted, becoming less formal. "I know this grief. I know this failure feeling. I too lost my nestmate and offspring to the creche. I too was not there to protect them." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. This alien warrior, this being who seemed so strong and unshakable, had experienced the same loss, had felt the same guilt and grief that now threatened to drown Daniel. Suddenly, the Comanche's presence here made sense in a way that nothing else had. Lisa Warren had heard every word, and she was frantically making notes on her tablet. This was unprecedented. The Comanche never shared personal information with humans, never spoke of their families or their losses. Their culture valued privacy and emotional reserve, keeping such matters strictly within their clans. Yet Stands in Thunder had just revealed his deepest pain to a human he had never formally met. In front of dozens of witnesses, Henry Clark moved forward slowly, his weathered farmer's hands clutching his hat. He stopped a respectful distance from the Comanche and spoke in his gruff voice. "We thank you for this honor. We do not fully understand it, but we feel its importance." Stands in Thunder turned those reflecting eyes on Henry, then swept his gaze across the assembled colonists. When he spoke again, his voice carried clearly to everyone present. "In my grief, my clan brothers did not let me be alone. They took the tools from my hands. They sang for my dead. They shared my burden." He looked back at Daniel. "Now I do this for you. This is the warrior way. No one should dig graves alone. Not Comanche, not human, not any being who knows love and loss." The simple truth of those words seemed to resonate through everyone present. Helen Carter was openly crying now, as were several others. Even the hardened soldiers who had arrived from the garrison had tears in their eyes. Daniel felt something shift inside him, like a wall beginning to crack. He had been so focused on his guilt, on his belief that he had to bear this alone as some kind of penance, that he had not considered that accepting help might be its own form of strength. The Comanche warrior had crossed every boundary of his culture to teach this lesson, and Daniel was finally beginning to understand. The graves were ready. The ceremony was not yet complete, but something fundamental had changed on this hillside. A bridge was being built between two species, constructed from shared grief and mutual recognition of what it meant to lose those you loved. And Daniel Hayes, standing in the starlight with bleeding hands and a breaking heart, was beginning to understand that he did not have to carry this weight alone.